This episode of Conjuncture was recorded in Detroit in March 2025 and produced with support of the Trinity Social Justice Institute and the Antipode Foundation.
Welcome to Conjuncture. My name's Jordan Cam. I'm really delighted to be here with Alex Loftus. Alex is a professor of political ecology in the Department of Geography at King's College London. He is the author of Everyday Environmentalism. He is the co-editor of Gramsci, Space, Nature, Politics. He's also the co-author of Discovering Political Ecology. His work appears in a number of important venues and journals such as Antipode, Progress in Human Geography, Urban Studies, and beyond. And I'm excited for the chance to sit down with him today in Detroit to talk about Gramsci's historical geographical materialism, his philosophy of praxis, subaltern groups and classes, as well as a climate crisis of our time. So thanks so much for taking the time to speak with me, Alex. I really appreciate it.
Thanks so much for having me on Conjuncture, Jordan.
Welcome. So I wanted to talk about your current research, where you're exploring how urban political ecology can help us challenge and confront the far right in this moment. So why is it important to analyze the climate crisis in terms of thinking about the far right?
It's an interesting question. I think there are various reasons why we need to think through the climate crisis in relation to this, because there's a paper that I've worked on with Joris Gort, who is based in the Netherlands, and there we were looking at how the far right had used certain framings of the environment as a way of mobilizing, and this helped to fuel a far-right political project in the Netherlands and eventually led to the rise of a farmer citizen movement and right-wing coalitions within the Netherlands itself. The way in which they were mobilizing there, they were using certain framings of rurality and urbanity. So this began to emerge in part because of measures that were being pushed through by the coalition government in the Netherlands, where they were seeking to rein in nitrogen emissions to meet EU standards. This would potentially have led to the closure of large-scale cattle farming in the Netherlands because of nitrogen emissions and nitrates leaching into protected areas. So the far right begins to mobilize against this and pits what they claim is an urban political, an urban metropolitan elite against the rural, these rural disenfranchised voters. So we can see how they were beginning to use that. And they were also beginning to use certain abstractions of nature versus society. They were also mobilizing alongside international right-wing movements. So there we see how the environment is woven into the rise of a right-wing movement. And we see lots of examples of that around the world at the moment. So the far right are able to use the climate crisis as a way of arguing that this pits the people against the power block in the kind of classic Laclauian framing of populism. But I think beyond that, there's something deeper, that the material foundations upon which fossil capital is built necessitate a challenge to climate politics. So there's been lots of interesting work recently questioning why it seems so impossible for us to transition to renewable forms of energy in the present moment. And I think some of the most convincing arguments around this suggest that our society is now so dependent on, or capitalist societies are now so dependent on fossil fuel resources because of the forms of value which they embody, that any attempt to transition beyond that is simply impossible. Even though, oddly, renewable forms of energy are by far the cheapest sources of energy in most parts of the world at the moment. So we confront this paradox where right-wing forces are making the argument that to move away from fossil fuel resources will cause an unnecessary economic burden on the common person or the people. At the same time, renewable forms of energy are the cheapest forms of they're the cheapest forms of generating electricity in the present moment. So I think we see these two really important articulations here. One, the way in which the right have woven in an environmental politics into a new coalition, pitting the people against a power bloc. And secondly, the material foundations of the society in which we're living depends on fossil fuels. So the right cannot envisage any way of transitioning beyond that.
Yeah, and you make this argument, we were on a panels together, New Directions and Gramscian Studies, that there's a kind of compulsion of, economic forces that leads to that kind of dependency. Could you talk about that argument?
Yeah, so I'm really interested in some of the ways in which value form debates have begun to unfold recently. So for some thinkers, this is about the abstract compulsion of economic relations. And I think fossil capital is based on a particular abstract compulsion of economic relations, which is preventing a transition to renewable forms of energy taking place. Again, if we begin to think with a Labour theory of value and the way in which fossil fuels embody a particular form of value, they embody socially necessary labour time. The argument put forward by some, such as Andreas Malm and Wim Carton, is that renewables as a free form of energy, it's a flow which is captured directly from the sun or the wind, and doesn't embody the same socially necessary labour time. So the lack of profitability within renewable forms of energy can be traced back to socially necessary labour time. And I find that a really interesting argument. I think it's more complicated than they're presenting it. And some of the work which I've been doing with colleagues looking at the solar transition in Spain begins to complicate that, and also begins to work across global value chains, from the production of solar modules in China all the way to struggles over land in Spain. So it's a more complicated argument. I also think some of these value form debates and the way in which they're played out also reach their limits when it comes to how we might struggle against fossil capital. And there, again, within the Malm and Carton book, there's some really interesting arguments in there, but it finishes on what for me is a deeply disappointing note, where they have some swipes at Gramsci arguing that the temporalities of the climate crisis mean that there's no way in which, and I quote them, there could be a long march. Instead, we need urgent political action. And for them, Gramsci simply cannot speak to this.
Yeah. And I know you have a alternative of Gramsci's relevance for understanding not just the climate chaos and crisis, but a lot of this research grows out of your long-term research on kind of everyday environmental struggles for access to water. One of the chapters that I've been eager to talk to you about appears in Everyday Environmentalism, where you kind of mobilize Gramsci to think through how his philosophy of praxis can help us understand and contribute to subaltern groups and classes, struggles over access to water, focused particularly in South Africa. And so I wonder if you could talk about how you mobilize Gramsci to understand those struggles.
Yeah, I think in a way, thinking through Gramsci's relevance to a politics of water is almost easier than thinking through Gramsci's relevance to the politics of climate change. Because the work that I carried out in South Africa was all about getting to grips with the way in which people were provisioning a household with water in different communities across Durban. And this was obviously classed, it was also raced, and it was based on a deeply gendered division of labour. So depending on where people lived in Durban, they accessed water in profoundly different ways. A lot of the work that I was doing was in an informal settlement where, again, there were some quite big disparities in how people were able to access water. Sometimes people had to walk long distances to a standpipe and carry water back. Sometimes they had water in the home, but that was a metered supply that would run out as soon as they were unable to pay the bill. So from that, I began to look at the ways in which these situated practices shaped knowledges of how people related to their broader environments. So how they related to water, how they also related to the politics of the transition in South Africa, their frustrations with the apartheid government, with the post-apartheid government. Really interesting in South Africa, I think, are the kind of contradictions which are playing out between the promises of the post-apartheid government, that incredibly progressive constitution which was signed in 1996, promising free basic water to all, the right to water, the human right to water, and the frustrations that those promises have not been lived up to. So when I was working in Durban, for example, there were 4,000 households which were being disconnected from the water network on a weekly basis. And that's households. So if we think of the numbers of people within those households, this is into the tens of thousands of people who were being disconnected from the water supply on a weekly basis in a country in which there's a guarantee of the human right to water. So Gramsci provided ways of moving from those situated practices of provisioning a household with water, classed, raced, gendered, and the knowledges that were produced. And I think it began to open up forms of critique because many of the protests were organized around these frustrations, these ways of understanding this broader politics. So Gramsci provided a way of moving from practices to knowledges, which is what I think the philosophy of praxis does so effectively.
Yeah, that argument, I think, really resonated for me because one of the things I think you do so convincingly in that chapter is to reflect on how it is that subaltern groups and classes' knowledge can be fragmentary, partial, and incoherent, but that the philosophy of praxis in dialogue with those knowledge, not dismissive or hostile to those knowledges, but can contribute to elaborating a kind of good sense within the common sense. So could you talk about that approach to analyzing those struggles?
Yeah. So when we were conducting research in Durban, in this informal settlement, I think very often what we saw was not an organized form of resistance. There was no the active social movement appeared to be something of a thing of the past in many respects. So this particular informal settlement had some very active social movements in the transition period. So in the late 1980s up until the early 1990s, some very active social movements there. But there was nothing organized there. Instead, what we tended to see were really almost wildcat protests. People have referred to them in South Africa as almost popcorn protests, that they were popping up in certain places. So what we see in those is a very clear critique of what's taking place, but not necessarily a clear sense of the politics and the broader sets of relations which needed to be mapped out. So again, with Gramsci, I think we find, and in that notion of common sense and good sense, he refers to both implicit conceptions of the world and explicit conceptions of the world. And in that translation from one to the other, it's about making coherent a particular political praxis, the bringing together of theory and practice. And this isn't some kind of a logical coherence. It's not, say, somehow these disorganized thoughts need to be ordered more logically. It's about fusing them really in a form of praxis that might actually transform things. So that was what I became really interested in. And again, I found resources within Gramsci that were particularly useful for thinking through those ideas.
Yeah, and you build in your research, build upon the work of the UC Berkeley anthropologist Donald Moore, who done just groundbreaking research on Gramscian political ecology. I'd gotten to meet, Donald at a Gramsci conference that I've worked with Jillian Hart and Marcus Green on at Berkeley in 2023. So could you talk about your dialogue with Donald Moore?
That's really interesting that you bring that up, actually, because I think going way back to my undergraduate years, that was when Liberation Ecology is the book in which Donald lays out this kind of Gramscian political ecology. It came out in 1996, Liberation Ecologies, and that book for me was transformative at the time as an undergraduate. I remember it seemed to really emphasize the politics in political ecology and a bringing together of environment and development through social movements that was really progressive. Donald's chapter, I think, is a chapter that really endures within that collection. And that was the first edition of Liberation Ecologies. I think subsequent editions of the book are actually less effective. But Donald's chapter, it emphasizes the kind of cultural politics that was so important to struggles over land in eastern Zimbabwe. And he emphasizes the importance of memory, of symbolism, and all sorts of the broader cultural politics through which struggles take place. So yeah, it's a really important chapter. And again, I think somewhat overlooked within political ecology, but it's been very important to my understanding of political ecology subsequently. I think it does something very different from what many other people were doing at the time.
Yeah, I hope that we can spark a renewed interest in that work, because there's a relationship between, the ongoing work about subaltern struggles, about political ecology that I think can learn from Donald's work.
Yeah.
When we organized these New Directions in Gramscian Studies panels at the AAG this week in Detroit, we were very fortunate to bring together you and your co-editors from Gramsci, Space, Nature, Politics, Stefan Kipfer, Jillian Hart, Mike Eakers, and that book, in my judgment, remains the most significant contribution to our understanding of Gramsci's spatial and ecological thinking to date. And one of the things that stood out for me was the choice to open that book with this wonderful essay by the late John Berger. And he reflects on how Gramsci's experience growing up in Sardinia shaped his theories of space and time and so on. Why did you choose to start with that Berger essay?
I love that. It's an open letter addressed to Subcomandante Marcos from the Zapatistas. And it was first published in Le Monde Diplomatique, and it was also published in the LA Times. Various other places published it. And then it came out as part of a collection of Berger's essays in the shape of a pocket. I really, I love Berger's writing, first of all. I think he writes beautifully. But this particular letter essay captures the way in which Gramsci's thought is a product of a specific set of practices in Sardinia. It's about as far as you can get from an environmentally deterministic perspective. And I think the problem is you could slip into an environmental determinism that Sardinia produced Gramsci's thought. But there, it's about those practices. He talks about the nuraghi and the patience of living with stones, the careful placing of stones in this, the landscape of Sardinia. He talks about the conquest, the waves of conquest that have shaped Sardinia, and how all of this was shaping Gramsci's thought. The essay itself, in a strange kind of aside, the publisher required us to get permission to actually use the essay, even though it had been an open letter. So we had to approach John Berger to ask for his permission for the essay. And at the time, a colleague, Andy Merrifield, was working on a biography of Berger. So he went to Berger's farmhouse in the Haute-Savoie in France to ask for his permission for us to use this essay, and they needed signed proof. So Andy was kind of our go-between. And it's really nice subsequently because Andy's written some beautiful essays as he's been living in Rome and working in the non-Catholic cemetery in Rome as a volunteer and tending to Gramsci's grave and making some really interesting connections between Gramsci's writings and Berger's writings all over again. So there's a nice connection there as well.
Yeah, no, I really encourage our viewers and listeners to read Merrifield's essays on Berger and the ongoing work that he's doing in that direction. I hope he'll publish this book.
Yeah.
As told you before. And you know, in Gramsci Space, Nature, Politics, using this as your kind of analytical point of departure, you introduce a number of important ways of reading Gramsci that remain distinct. You know, the emphasis on his insights as a spatial thinker, as an ecological thinker, as a materialist. And you also, I think, in that essay are making a particular intervention in that conjuncture. So how did the conjuncture shape the work that you and your co-editors and the authors in the volume were doing?
Yeah, so I think there's both a kind of political conjuncture and perhaps a scholarly conjuncture. So political conjuncture was a moment of austerity. It was post-financial crisis in which we were grappling with, there were various social movements that were emerging around the world at that particular point. And so Gramsci seemed to provide a set of inroads into making sense of those social movements and how they might connect to a broader politics and a deeper history. There was also the kind of scholarly conjuncture, which, as Gramsci's writings were becoming increasingly accessible to an Anglophone audience, and new, more philological readings of Gramsci were beginning to emerge. The publication of Peter Thomas's The Gramscian Moment, which was, I think, a really important moment in Anglophone debate, which brought together so much scholarship. So that really began to shape our own thought, but at the same time, I think also left us more frustrated that this spatialized reading of Gramsci and the geographies in Gramsci's writings are to us so clear and so obvious. This continued to be neglected within the broader philological term. So all sorts of fantastic writings coming out, but we saw our intervention as really emphasizing the importance of space, nature, and politics within Gramsci's writings.
Yeah. And, you do this interesting work, I think, in relationship to the philological turn. And, so much of that has been enhanced by the Italian scholarship that's encouraged new readings based on the critical editions of the notebooks, not just a kind of singular reliance and kind of the Euro-American Anglophone world on that 71 edition that's selections of the prison notebooks. But you also bring it into particular historical, geographical context, empirical work, field work. Talk about that approach of the philological work and then the locating it in a concrete historical and geographical conjuncture, as you all would put it, I think.
Yeah. Again, I think that's what we learned from Gramsci's writings, that he's engaging in real depth with the histories of Italy, with the broader histories of Italy in a global context, with Fordism in the US. So these conversations are developing. So Gramsci's own writings are both deeply theoretical, but also very empirical. They're very engaged with concrete histories. And that was something we felt could be one of our contributions within the text as well. So the chapters themselves range from brilliant discussions of the MST movement in Brazil, for example, with movements in Nepal, my work in South Africa, Mike Ika's work in Canada with tree planting. We're working across many different contexts. So it's both about developing those ideas in relation to historically and geographically specific moments, but also continuing that dialogue with the philological tradition, which is, I think, just what you said earlier.
Yeah, thanks for this, Alex. And I mean, obviously, there's so much more to say about Gramsci, space, nature, politics, and I couldn't recommend our viewers and listeners, consult it more strongly. I wanted to ask you, you wrote a kind of essay that builds upon and extends the framework that you've been developing in these earlier works that we've been talking about, and on Gramsci as a historical geographical materialist that appeared in this great volume, Rethinking Gramsci's Notebooks, in 2019. And in that essay, you talk about Gramsci's contributions to what scholars in radical geography have named as a kind of spatialized Marxism. But then you reflect that there's been a kind of neglect of Gramsci in that, and a failure to engage in any kind of systematic or thorough dialogue with the Sardinian. And so I wanted to ask you why you think that is, first, and then second, what could be learned from a deeper dialogue with Gramsci?
Yeah, I mean, it has to be one of the most bizarre paradoxes that the most geographical Marxist thinker is the least read within geography. I can't make much sense of that. I mean, there are perhaps obvious reasons. Someone like Harvey has made the claim that he was too busy reading Marx, reading Capital than reading Capital. So he was less interested in Marxist thinkers. He was more interested in engaging directly with Marx's own writings. So could explain it, but I really don't get it. I think more recently, there's been kind of a divergence between critical geography, which is built perhaps on post-Althusserian traditions as well. So, but once again, that it's ignored Gramscian traditions, and Gramsci's kind of been dismissed as perhaps a hopeless humanist, I think. And with critical geography building on this post-Althusserian tradition, it's gone in post-humanist and theoretical anti-humanist directions, maybe. But that's a misreading of Gramsci, and it's a failure to actually engage with his work. So I mean, the resources which are available within the notebooks for geographical thinking, I think, are just beyond compare. And I keep waiting for this Gramscian moment to happen in geography, and yet it still doesn't seem to be taking place. So there are reasons, I think, to do with what people were reading at particular times, Harvey reading Marx, and then the kind of post-Althusserian traditions which have developed. The resources that are available, again, I think we lay out within Gramsci's Space, Nature, Politics, a really, really rich engagement with histories and geographies, an ability to think politically about histories and geographies, and a richly spatialized reading of Marx. I mean, Gramsci was a kind of a historical geographical materialist before there were historical geographical materialists. So before we'd even come up with the term. So, yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, some of that, you developed that way of thinking from growing up as a Southerner, of course, but also, studying philology and geography. I mean, you point out that you actually taught geography.
Yeah.
I mean, you want to talk about it at Ustica.
Yeah. So, and again, I think, Gramsci taught geography after he was imprisoned on Ustica. He was also engaging with geographical ideas through his linguistic training. He was thinking across geographies. So he trained as a linguist when he went to Turin, obviously. And from some of the Italian debates, there's the argument made that there are linguistic roots to Gramsci's reading of hegemony, which I think pushed the argument perhaps too far. But we can see how those linguistic understandings of the movement of language shaped his reading of Marx, shaped his reading of hegemony, shaped his thinking on the Southern Question, which is a profoundly geographical essay. And again, I think some of the really interesting engagements, your work on the Southern Question, emphasize that geography and its relevance to the present moment. So yeah, huge resources there.
Yeah, well, thanks for all you've done to keep this on the agenda for Route to Geography. And, I'd be remiss if I didn't note that we were very pleased to be co-sponsored this year by the Antipode Foundation and to have developed this season's series in dialogue with the editorial collective, including with Yusuf Al-Balushi and others. And I wanted to ask you about some of the work that you had done as a member of the editorial collective between 2019 and 2024. And my memory serves, you were also editor-in-chief between May 2022 and 2024. And in that capacity, you had emphasized the kind of work that radical geography has been poised and remains poised to do in relationship to the conjuncture. So could you talk a bit about that vision?
Yeah, I mean, the time on the editorial collective has easily been the most enjoyable part of my academic career, I think. It's really nice as well because Gramsci Space, Nature, Politics was published in the Antipode book series. So Antipode has supported the work that many of us have been doing with Gramsci for quite a while. More recently, we were very fortunate in being able to publish a really important essay by Gillian Hart on modalities of conjunctural analysis, which is obviously very important to those listening to Conjuncture. That essay is absolutely crucial to thinking through Gramsci's relevance within the present moment. And the editorial collective, I mean, obviously the paper went out for full peer review, but the editorial collective were really supportive of the publication of that essay. I think the broader collective at the moment is just absolutely fantastic and doing really interesting work. Ayaz Malik, Yusuf Al-Balushi, all of the people on that collective are absolutely wonderful scholars. So I leave it with such sadness because, as I say, I enjoyed being part of that collective so much, but I also am just in awe of the wonderful people on that collective now and the brilliant work that the foundation is doing in supporting projects right the way across radical geography.
Yeah, well, and our hats off to you for that work, and really excited, obviously, to continue to partner with both the foundation and the journal. Alex, I could talk to you all day. It's such a pleasure to get the chance to sit down with you, but is there anything that I haven't asked that you would like to add?
No, I don't think so. It's been a real pleasure to be here. Thank you, Jordan.
Thank you. And I also want to thank all our viewers and listeners for joining us. Stay tuned.